It's my great pleasure to welcome back our longtime friend, former student, Stuart Reid, back to Dartmouth to talk with us. Stuart is a Dartmouth alum, a class of '08. He was a government department major and a French minor, and it turns out that I'm not sure if this book certainly couldn't have been researched the way you did it without the French minor, and maybe the government department major helped to some degree as well. Stuart is the executive editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, and I would say institutions change, and institutions' role in society change. But for decades and to this day, I just simply think it is the case that Foreign Affairs magazine is the means by which the American foreign policy elite speak with each other. And so the position of being an executive editor at Foreign Affairs is in some ways curating much of the discussion in the American foreign policy establishment. But he's here today neither because he's a Dartmouth alum nor because of his position at Foreign Affairs. He's here today because he's written a truly terrific book, a book called the Lumumba Plot, which I'm holding up right here. The Lumumba Plot, which is available for purchase right outside. This is a book which is many things. It's a biography. It's also a leap into the chaos of rapidly decolonizing Africa. It's a dive back into the Cold War with all the exciting intrigue and then actual horrors. It is a story about covert operations, about assassination, and to paraphrase the New York Times review about Stuart's book, it's a story about what is lost when great power competition plays out in the developing world. A story which was obviously extremely relevant in the 1960s and is relevant to a degree that I think even many watchers of American foreign policy don't realize today. It's playing out right now in the Maritime Pacific, in South America, and in Sub-Saharan Africa once again. So the things that Stuart's here to talk about is both fascinating history, and it's a lens for you to understand some of the things that are happening beneath the scenes or behind the scenes today. The book has been very, very well reviewed in phenomenal places, in the New York Times and The Economist, the Times of London and the New Yorker. It's a terrific read. I was joking with a colleague right before this about, of all the things I've read recently which have taught me about international relations, it was the one that was also a joy to read. So it's a great read. It reads like a thriller and a novel, but it is really a great example of historical nonfiction. What we're going to do today is Stuart's going to speak for about 15 or 20 minutes. He's going to show you some slides and give you some of the highlights or some of the ideas from the book. I've got a handful of questions. I'll then come back up and I'll speak to Stuart for 15 or 20 minutes. And then we'll throw it open to you and have just a broader conversation with this group for the remaining time. So please join me in welcoming back to Dartmouth, Stuart Reid.
Thanks so much for coming. So I could not have written this book without Dartmouth. The professors in the government department really taught me how to think and write, were crucial for this book, and then also specifically the French minor. Much of the source material for this book was written in French, and I went through it myself, and so I would not be here today were it not for Dartmouth. So this is Patrice Lumumba. So I think a lot of people haven't heard of him, at least in the United States. Those who have heard of him probably don't know much about him. And part of the goal of my book was to sort of recover him and tell his story in his own words through his own actions, rather than the many things that were sort of grafted on to him after the fact. So Lumumba was he got his start he was born in a rural village in the middle of Belgian Congo. He then moved to the city of Stanleyville, now Kisangani, and it was there that he began his rapid ascent up the colonial system under the Belgians in Congo. So he was born in 1925. He becomes what is called an évolué, literally an evolved person, which was an official classification that the Belgians had in the Congo, which showed that you were He spoke good French, used a knife and fork, that sort of thing. And this was a status he eagerly claimed. He then found work at a post office as a postal clerk, so working for the colonial administration. And he sort of climbed the rungs as an obedient colonial subject and became a prominent person in the town of Stanleyville. He then was arrested for embezzling money from the post office, which he admitted, and was thrown in jail for a year in 1956, and wrote a book manuscript that was never published during his life, but was published posthumously. And what's striking about that book, he's offering very oblique criticisms of the colonial system. Part of that was strategic. He knew what could and could not be said, but it also, I think, reflected an evolution in progress. So you look back at what Lumumba was writing in 1956, and he was asking politely for very meek reforms to the colonial system, not independence. And this was really representative of what was going on in the Congo at the time, compared with other African colonies where full-throated calls for independence had broken out. There was nothing of the sort in the Congo yet. The Belgians had deliberately prevented the emergence of a political class. Professional opportunities were off limits after a certain level to Congolese people. And there was censorship, political activity was banned. There were no sort of proto-legislatures like there were in French and British colonies. So all of this, the Belgians had this expression, no elites, no problems. And for a long time, this worked. Then, of course, inevitably, the Congolese population at last rose up, and ideas about independence infiltrated the colony. And in 1959, there were riots in the capital, Leopoldville. And so things moved very, very quickly. After years and decades of delay and zero progress towards independence, all of a sudden, events moved rapidly. And so in January 1960, there was a roundtable conference in Brussels where the Congolese political class negotiated with the Belgians the details of independence. By this point, Lumumba had started his own, co-founded a political party, the Congolese National Movement, and emerged as one of the leading independence activists. But it was a very quick journey from the moderate Lumumba writing polite messages in prison to the nationalist Lumumba calling for immediate independence. And the Belgians, after years of delay and foot dragging, realized that they needed to grant it. They were wary of a colonial war of the type that was engulfing Algeria, and so they agreed to independence on June 30th, 1960. That was the date of independence. There were elections that spring, and Lumumba won the most votes of anyone, and so he was asked to form a government. And here is Lumumba in the center, or center-left, with the fellow members of his government. And it was an unwieldy coalition government, 23 different ministers, many different ethnic groups represented, many different political parties. Because of the Belgian policy on education, there was no higher education until the very end of colonialism. There were fewer than 20 Congolese university graduates in the entire world, and only 2 of them were in this government. Lumumba himself had never advanced past the Leopoldville postal school. But it was a moment of optimism. At long last, the country was becoming free and in the hands of the Congolese. This is a photo that became one of the iconic images of what was to be called the Congo crisis. And this is taken the day before independence, so June 29th. And in the car is the president of Congo, Joseph Kasavubu. That's a ceremonial position largely, and the king of the Belgians, King Baudouin. And a man has grabbed the sword of King Baudouin out of his scabbard and is running through the crowd with it. He was quickly tackled and the sword was returned. But the message was unmistakable. It was, we are in charge now. And it was sort of a harbinger of some of the chaos that was to come. So on June 30th, the Congo becomes formally independent. Things proceed more or less calmly. over the next few days. And then on July 5th, the crisis begins. The army, the colonial army, had been sort of just kept in place. There was an all-white, all-Belgian officer corps that remained in power. And predictably, that was not acceptable to the Congolese rank and file, who promptly mutinied. And they went through the streets, terrorizing the white population, which then fled en masse. And so here's a picture of Belgian refugees getting off the ferry, leaving Leopoldville. So within days of independence, you have this army mutiny, you have this massive white flight, and that was relevant because the Belgians were the ones, in many respects, still running all the sort of technical aspects of the country. The judges, the air traffic controllers, all that was still in Belgian hands, and suddenly that expertise was wiped out. Meanwhile, the Belgian military intervenes. There are Belgian paratroopers dropping down all across the Congo. They intervened without Congolese permission, so essentially it was an invasion, a foreign invasion of Belgium's former colony. Lumumba, as prime minister, is struggling to react to all of this. And one of the first decisions he makes is to put his friend in charge of the military, in charge of the process of Africanizing the military. The white officer corps has been fired, and everyone's going to move up a rank. And so there will at last be Congolese officers. And the man Lumumba put in charge of that was his friend Joseph Mobutu, who would later be known as Mobutu Sese Seko. And they were very close friends. Lumumba was sort of the mentor of Mobutu. Mobutu had been his sort of secretary and errand runner for many years. Mobutu had served in the military for 6 or 7 years in the colonial army, and then become a journalist, and met Lumumba through those sort of elite intellectual circles. That decision succeeds in calming the mutiny, except then something else happens, which is the province of Katanga, in the bottom right there, announces its secession from the rest of Congo on July 11th, 1960. So again, independence was June 30th, secession is announced July 11th. Things are moving very quickly in a bad direction. There were many reasons for the secession. Katanga has sort of always been separate from the rest of the colony. It was the mineral-rich, and still is to this day, the mineral-rich area of the Congo, providing all the revenues. There was an ethnic dimension to the secession as well. But within 2 weeks of independence, Lumumba's country was falling apart. So Lumumba first calls on the United Nations for help, sending a telegram to Dag Hammarskjöld, the Secretary General, asking for some sort of help. He doesn't even really know what. And the UN rallies with this extremely impressive peacekeeping operation that was the first of its kind. The UN had monitored ceasefires and truces before, but now it was being asked to restore order to an entire country. And within a week or so, there were thousands of UN peacekeepers in the Congo. They were drawn mostly from fellow African countries, Tunisia, Ghana, Morocco, Guinea. And the goal of the UN operation was to, essentially replace the Belgians in terms of the sort of technical administration aspects, and then also provide a policing presence and restore order. Lumumba imagined that the UN would help him retake Katanga and bring it back into the national fold, but the UN refused to do that. Dag Hammarskjöld's argument was that if the UN tried to go into Katanga, they would be starting a war. They would be at war with the secessionists there. And that secession, by the way, was heavily backed by Belgium. And so his position, Hammarskjöld's position, was the UN, that is a political issue to be negotiated carefully. We can't just storm in. Lumumba was thinking, I invited in the UN, so why can't I tell them what to do? So in late July 1960, Lumumba flies to the United States, his first foreign trip as leader. He meets with Dag Hammarskjöld in New York. That meeting is a failure on a substantive level, and that he doesn't get any progress on the UN entering Katanga. And despite this picture, it's also a failure on a stylistic level too, and a person-to-person level. They never really see eye to eye. One African diplomat in New York would contend that Hammarskjöld simply couldn't imagine the idea of sort of being talked back to by an African leader. And there was really not a meeting of the minds, whatever the opposite of a meeting of the minds is. So then Lumumba goes to Washington, D.C. There he is meeting with Christian Herter on the right, the Secretary of State, and Douglas Dillon, a high-level State Department official, I think Undersecretary of State or Deputy. And that meeting, too, is a failure. He asks the United States for economic aid. He asks them for a plane, which may seem like a vain request, but in fact, Lumumba had been thwarted in his efforts to fly across the Congo. The Belgian pilots would refuse to take him to certain cities. The Katangan secessionists would not let him land in Katanga, and so that was a very practical request. But the United States rebuffed all of his requests, told him he had to go through the UN. It was also very disappointing to Lumumba that he did not get to meet with President Eisenhower, who was on vacation in Newport, Rhode Island at the time. And by this point in his presidency, Eisenhower, by all accounts, had really checked out. He had lost interest in the job. He was playing golf all the time and not particularly engaged. This was in the final 6 or 7 months of his term. So Lumumba goes back to Congo, but he's flailing. His country is in the throes of chaos. Katanga remains independent. There's still chaos in the streets. And so he makes the fateful decision to call on the Soviet Union for help, sending a cable to Khrushchev, at first asking him to watch things closely, and then asking for specific military aid that he hopes will allow him to retake Katanga. And that was an unforgivable sin in the Cold War context and set off alarm bells at the CIA. And this, as you may know, is Allen Dulles, the director of the CIA. And there's a fateful meeting that happens on August 18th, 1960. Dulles is meeting with Eisenhower and other top officials in the White House at a National Security Council meeting. And Lumumba's latest antics come up. He's just threatened to kick out the UN. He's been playing footsie with the Soviets. And at that point, Eisenhower says something, and we don't know his exact words, but something to the effect that Lumumba had to be physically eliminated. And we know this for a few reasons. And Eisenhower looked directly at Allen Dulles when he said this. We know this, one, because there was a note taker at the meeting who witnessed this and would later testify to the church committee about what he heard. And when he went back to his office to write up his notes from the meeting, he was told not to mention the president's comment about Lumumba, and so that was deliberately kept out of the record. But he would later testify to the church committee about his recollections. Also in the Eisenhower Library in Kansas, I found handwritten notes from the meeting taken by a State Department official where he wrote the word Lumumba and then a big black X next to the name, which is not proof, but does suggest a possibility. And most important, we know that this was said because of what happens next, which is that the CIA sets in motion this bizarre assassination plot. Dulles gives the order, and it's carried down the chain of command, and the CIA, with its top scientist, a man named Sidney Gottlieb, pick a poison that is then flown to Congo by Sidney Gottlieb, the CIA chemist, and hand-delivered to this man, the CIA station chief in Congo at the time, a man named Larry Devlin. Devlin, he has gotten a cable in advance saying, someone's going to meet you, it's a highly sensitive operation, meet them at this hotel at this time, but he doesn't know what it's about. And when he finds out in person, he would later claim to be shocked by what he's being asked to do. He says, where does this order come from? And he's told that it comes from Eisenhower, from the top. So Devlin is tasked with getting the poisons into Lumumba's food or toothpaste, but he's never able to because events intervene. On September 15th, 1960, or 14th, excuse me, Mobutu, the head of the military, announces that he's taking power in a coup. Lumumba has been fired by the President Kasavubu. Lumumba then turned around and said that you can't fire me, I fire you, and fires Kasavubu. And so the two top political leaders have fired each other. And so that's when Mobutu steps into the stalemate and announces that the politicians are, quote, neutralized and he's taking over. He did this with CIA encouragement and money. Before the coup, he asked for thousands of dollars, which Devlin dutifully handed to him in a briefcase. Devlin would later say that this coup was, quote, supported, arranged, and managed by the CIA. And so Mobutu's now in charge, and Lumumba is under house arrest, unable to leave the prime minister's residence. That, in fact, is why he can't be poisoned, because no one can get in there. He's surrounded by a ring of UN troops and then a ring of Congolese troops. And here's Mobutu a little later, looking more confident. I love this photo of him. And Mobutu is a sort of cipher of a character. And in writing the book, it was hard because there's very little on early Mobutu. There's lots of stuff of him in the 70s and 80s, but at this point, he was behind the scenes. He didn't even appear in newspapers until I think, August and September 1960, and often his name was misspelled. He was a background character who suddenly thrust himself to the front of the stage. So Lumumba's languishing under house arrest, and he then, in late November 1960, makes another fateful decision, which is to try and escape house arrest. He hides in the backseat of a car under the legs of his servants going home for the day. And there's a big thunderstorm in Leopoldville, the capital, and no one somehow notices that he's slipped out. And he's trying to drive back to Stanleyville, his stronghold in the east of the Congo, where he's hoping his allies have gathered there. He's hoping he can sort of rally them and come back to power that way by announcing that his is the legitimate government of the Congo. A few days after escaping, he's caught. Again, I should point out with CIA help, which helped arrange the search party that captured Lumumba. And Lumumba is thrown, here's Lumumba under house arrest up on the balcony speaking to the crowd. So Lumumba's captured and he's flown back to the capital. And here are a series of photos of him being captured and sort of manhandled. And these would become iconic images from the crisis. This one particularly, where he really, to me, looks like he's calm and sort of has accepted his fate. And the videos suggest that as well. You can go on YouTube and find newsreel footage of this moment. So at this point, it's and he's thrown in a military prison, and the hope is he'll be unable to escape from that. And the timing is important here. This is December 1960. Kennedy has been elected, but hasn't yet taken power. The Eisenhower administration is in its final weeks. And a fear starts to develop on the ground in Congo that Lumumba might come to power. Yes, he's in military prison, but the rest of the Congo is still chaotic. Lumumba's out of power, and yet the chaos continues. So perhaps he wasn't the problem. And so there's an idea that develops that he can be brought back to power. Instead of having an illegal military regime in charge, there will be, once again, a democratic government with Lumumba as prime minister. Perhaps he'll have a more moderate coalition with some different ministers. But there's a real movement afoot to bring him back to power. In fact, there are some on the incoming Kennedy team who are backing this plan and agree with it. And the UN is also moving in that direction. There also, at a more practical level, was the problem that the soldiers guarding Lumumba at the military prison were on the verge of revolt, threatening to free their prime minister. And so Mobutu is terrified of what's going to happen. He thinks that Lumumba's return is imminent, which would mean his own demise. And Larry Devlin, the CIA station chief, also worries about this very same prospect. A return of Lumumba to power, he considered Lumumba dangerous, pro-Soviet. A return of Lumumba to power, in his view, would mean giving Congo over to the Soviets and putting an erratic man back in charge. It would also, of course, mean the rejection of his entire professional activities for the past 6 months. And so on January 14th, 1961, Devlin learns from Mobutu or someone in his circle that Lumumba is about to be sent to his death. And so he does two things when he hears this explosive bit of news. One, he doesn't tell Mobutu to put the brakes on this operation and not send Lumumba to his death. And they had a very close relationship. Devlin was routinely handing over briefcases of cash to Mobutu, advising him on every minor political issue. So in the context of their relationship, his failure to try and talk him out of this was a green light. The second thing Devlin did was that he deliberately didn't tell CIA headquarters in Washington about what he had just learned, even as he was updating them about other twists and turns in events. And the reason he sat on this information was because he realized correctly that if he told Washington what was about to happen, he would be asked to intervene. Just days earlier, he had asked for tens of thousands of more money to pay off Mobutu and was told, we have to put that question on hold. There's a presidential transition happening. That's a question for the Kennedy administration. There are to be no big decisions made in this brief transition period. And so Devlin likely understood that had he told Washington about this other development, that would have set off a flurry of activity in Washington that probably would have ended with Devlin being told to intervene to save Lumumba's life. So he didn't do anything and sat on that news, didn't try and talk Mobutu out of it. And on January 17th, Lumumba was taken out of his cell early in the morning and put on a series of planes to the province of Katanga, which was led by this man, Moise Tshombe, separatist leader of Katanga. And Lumumba was flown to Elizabethville, the capital, and he was tortured the whole flight there. He was tortured more upon his arrival. Tshombe took part in the beatings and even stained his own suit with blood in the process. And then late at night on January 17th, Lumumba was driven out a mile out of town into a remote clearing and put in front of a firing squad of Congolese soldiers who were answering to Belgian officers because Katanga had not Africanized its military like every other province. And those officers were in turn answering to Tshombe's secessionist government. And so late at night, Lumumba was shot dead and buried in a shallow pit. And this is the spot, a photo taken recently, where Lumumba was killed. And that man is a man named Lumumba Movati Njibu. And he was 20 years old at the time in 1961, and he actually witnessed Lumumba's death. He was hunting with his father or on a hunting trip with his father when he saw headlights turn off the road, and he and his father hid behind a tree or an anthill and watched what happened. And I actually had the chance to interview him, and there's me wearing a Dartmouth shirt, I should point out, with an interpreter, and he had memories of that night, and so I was able to incorporate his recollections into the book. For the United States, so that was the end of the Lumumba story, but it was the beginning of a different story for the United States, which was that Mobutu was propped up by a series of U.S. presidents. So here he is in May 1963, meeting with JFK, who, even though early on some of the Kennedy team was pro Lumumba, once Lumumba was dead, that was a moot point, and everyone got in line behind Mobutu. And he would continue to be supported by a succession of US presidents. And just to finish up, there was what happened in the Congo was that the United States got tied to Mobutu. His regime was sort of stamped, made in America. And there was a memo written in 1965, just days before Mobutu took full formal power in his second coup and anointed himself president. And an NSC staffer was debating what the United States should do in reaction to Mobutu. And the memo ended with him saying, "He is already our man." And I think that was such a telling line that really explained a lot of US policy in Congo, which would then become Zaire for years to come. So that is the story I tell in my book of this moment of hope and independence that ended in tragedy for Lumumba and dictatorship for the Congolese people. So thank you. Stuart, I think you're lab.
So what we're going to do next is I have about 15 minutes, 20 at most, of questions I'm going to ask Stuart. And then after that, we're going to turn it over to the audience and invite you guys to lead a discussion or ask questions of Stuart for the remaining time. Okay? So I've already given away my bottom line. I've already revealed my takeaway, which is the book is terrific. It's fascinating. It's tragic. It's sad. It's an easy read. I'll start off with kind of like the easiest questions, and I'll go into maybe more challenging terrain in a few minutes. But just I'm interested, like what led you to this story? It's a world of stories you could tell. How did you? I mean, this is a phenomenal one. How did you discover this?
So it was happenstance, really. I had the opportunity to travel to Congo in 2014 to write a magazine article that was focused on the present day. And as a result of that, I was sort of tagging along with the US diplomat there. But there's no history in what I was looking into. And I was immediately sort of taken with the country at a visceral level. And then I started reading up on the history. And the more I read, the more I realized there was this brief moment in 1960 and 1961 where the Congo was front page news of the New York Times every day, literally. And yet I hadn't heard of the Congo crisis. I had barely heard of Patrice Lumumba. And so I wondered, what is this? Why was something such a big deal at the time? It later became overshadowed by all the other Cold War crises. And then the more I read, also the more I realized there were these fascinating characters at the heart of the story. Dag Hammarskjöld, Larry Devlin, Mobutu, and above all, Lumumba. And so I sort of just became obsessed with the story at a certain point and realized that it had to be a book. There had been a lot of good academic work on the topic, but no one had really touched it for general readers in a long time. So that's how it all began.
So when I read it, given what I typically think about it, I'm reading this, and my brain is constantly taking me to the 21st century. I'm thinking about U.S. support for dictatorships, U.S. Enhancement of dictatorships, occasionally maybe U.S. helping topple regimes in worlds. But I'm wondering, is that where your brain was? Like, to some extent, did this resonate with you because of parallels you felt to the current world? Or were you really drawn into principally the drama of the time, the drama of the people, and the drama of the time?
More the latter. The parallels emerged as I was working on it, but I didn't go into this thinking I want to find a good example of a historical crisis that has modern day parallels. But they are undeniable. I mean, it's a long tradition in U.S. foreign policy of backing the pro-American guy, even if he's unsavory. And a long tradition also of what William Fulbright called the arrogance of power, the idea that because we can intervene and meddle, well, perhaps we should. And that it really, what was sort of so confusing for me writing the book was, why did America care about who was in power in Congo? harder question to answer than I would have expected. It wasn't as simple as, oh, well, Congo has lots of minerals and therefore greedy Americans want them. It had to do more with Cold War thinking about communism and denying the Soviets a victory wherever one might appear. And then also just this sort of logic of its own of controlling and meddling and directing and guiding that took on its own momentum.
So let's push further into this. One read of what you wrote and one read of what you presented is that you actually captured a transition there that initially the United States didn't care about him and didn't care about his government, and the president blew him off. He did get a meeting with was it Christian Herter? So he got some attention in Washington, but they suddenly started caring the moment he reached out to the Soviet Union. So is it fair to say they didn't care and then they cared strongly in a negative way, or did they care more initially than I'm saying?
The pre-crisis, they didn't care at all. We know that from the fact that the CIA station chief wasn't even in position on the date of independence. He was scheduled to arrive later. They put a relatively inexperienced person in power. So the Belgian Congo was not expected to be a hotspot in the Cold War at all, by anyone. Once there was a crisis, and particularly once it involved the UN, I think that's when it really elevated and became on American policymakers' radar screen. But that was more because it was the UN and because the United States had a lot of influence with the UN, and at that point, although it was changing, still saw the UN as a vehicle for US policy. And then, but you're essentially right, that everything changed when Lumumba appealed to the Soviets.
So tell us more about that process, the process by which we went from what was actually, from his standpoint, good indifference to some extent, to when we decided, we meaning President Eisenhower decided he had to go. As you point out in your book, he reached out to the Soviet Union, but the Soviets didn't seem that interested. And so how did this work that we decided that the prospect of communism, or more importantly, partnership with the Soviet Union, was so dire that we had to take lethal action? Did you figure out anything about that process? Was it just Alan Dulles that got onto his radar screen, or was there big deliberation, or how did that play out?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges was to, with my 21st century eyes, looking back on the Cold War, paranoia, it just seems so over the top and unnecessary. And you read these cables and they sort of read like conspiracy theories about, the communists doing this or that. To give you just one example, Devlin counted the number of, quote, communist personnel in the Congo as several hundred. And the way he did this was he paid a source at the airport to count every single white person coming off a plane, that wasn't from Europe or something like that. And so he included all sorts of Soviet air technicians who were just part of the UN operation and totally above board. He included, a team of Czech doctors that were sent there to do medical work. But in his mind, this didn't seem to cause him any problems. So I think what really explains it is just a degree of paranoia. When it's the height of the Cold War, World War II is still fresh in memory, it really did seem existential. I think also the mental map that policymakers were using was Eastern Europe, which was an entirely different situation where there really was Soviet domination and intense Soviet meddling in the politics of various states. And so what the Americans couldn't quite understand was that the Third World, as it was known, was an entirely different game. And in the case of the Congo, the Soviets weren't all that interested. This was still 1960. Their power projection capabilities were not what they'd become. They viewed it as this backwater place where they could maybe score some political propaganda points about the evil imperialist Belgians and what they were doing, but it wasn't going to be a central concern of Soviet foreign policy at all.
So, you raise a bunch of interesting things there, and I'll come back to them in a couple minutes, but already it kind of plants the question in my mind, is the main tragedy here the action that we supported, toppling a government leading somebody to be killed? Or is the main horror just misidentification? It wasn't necessary in that case. And I know you, and I know you feel it was the first thing. The means were terrible, the action was terrible, et cetera. But it does lead us down an interesting chain of thought about, was this simply misidentification? Or is the very act of intervention itself, even had the Soviets actually been interested in setting up a political base, is that also illegitimate?
Well, I think in the case of the Congo, you don't really have to choose either, because Lumumba was fundamentally misjudged by the United States. He had cut his teeth opposing Belgian imperialism. As he himself was at pains to repeat, he was not going to turn around and accept Soviet domination. The Soviets themselves weren't interested. So Lumumba was, it would be incorrect to view him as someone who was about to let in the Soviets. That's true. What's also true is then the means that the United States used to undermine him and actions that eventually led to his death were terrible and unethical, and so they weren't even needed. Even if you accept the sort of hard Cold War logic, this is not a case where it needed to be applied.
Yeah, fair. Let me ask you a question that just came to me today. It didn't occur to me when I read the passage, but I saw a video of you reading a passage describing the early days or weeks of the Lumumba administration. And you described it as chaos, and you weren't even talking about the Katanga secession or the UN operation. You're just describing the actual way he was running his government. I mean, you didn't say, well, meetings multi-hours late, total incoherence as to who got to see him and who didn't get to see him. You just described kind of a scene which was kind of a basket case. And as I heard you reading that passage today, I wondered, maybe this is too cynical, putting aside the horror of intervention, putting aside the horror of assassination and torture, was this all about to fall apart anyway? Like, was his path that he was either about incompetence in governance, was about to lead to his coup, maybe by Mobutu or somebody else, or alternatively repression, that he was gonna have to stamp down the people who'd be dissatisfied with his incompetence? So was this as tenuous as I felt it was when I heard you reading?
Well, it sort of depends on what time point you're looking at, because by the time that passage takes place, it's August 1960, there's already been a mutiny, a Belgian-backed secession. There are American-financed anti-Lumumba protesters in the streets, parliament's being bribed by the CIA. So it was not Lumumba on his own without any foreign interference at that point. And so in some sense, the shambolic disarray of the government, I'm sure, was a reaction to the incredible crisis that was being put upon it. Lumumba had a real sense of paranoia, which turned out to be justified. He was always smelling a Belgian plot. About half of them were true and the other half weren't. So, but he was not wrong to. So I don't think you can disentangle that chaotic style from the outside interference. But some of it, I think, was inherent to him and reflective of his leadership style. But there was, Congo was a democracy and had a parliament, and so there was, in theory, a normal political process for dealing with a leader like that. That was never used in the case of Lumumba. Instead, it was extra legal processes and force ultimately that removed him. So yes, Lumumba was made many mistakes and had many aspects to his leadership that were not conducive to stability or to winning over Western diplomats. But I think it's always important to highlight the forces of what he was up against.
Tell us a little bit about the consequences of this. So you kind of previewed a little bit in your talk. It's a fascinating story about so many things, but it's also a story that was really momentous for the development of the Congo and also maybe the development of U.S. foreign policy. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the most important outcome of the events of 60 and 61 was to remove a popular politician who represented a broad swath of Congolese public opinion, remove him from the scene by killing Lumumba. and the installation and propping up of a leader who was not that at all in Mobutu. And so, predictably, a few years after Lumumba's death, the Congo rises up in rebellion. Followers carrying on his name are fighting the central government, Mobutu's troops. Mobutu manages to put those rebellions down only with the help of the CIA, which set up this massive paramilitary operation. And then you get the 70s and 80s and 90s of increasingly decrepit rule by Mobutu. And so you have a country that is led by someone who's utterly unrepresentative of the people and acts like it and steals massive amounts of money, has villas all across Europe, and is failing to provide any semblance of governance to the people. And then, most crucially and predictably, that regime collapses in 1996-97. The bottom falls out of it. Not coincidentally, that's after the Cold War is over and the US has cut him loose. And that collapse led to a series of civil wars that killed millions of people. So you can really trace a straight line from the chaos in Congo in the 90s and early 2000s back to the decisions made in 60 and 61. And then for the US, the operation was seen as a success because in narrow Cold War terms, you had gotten rid of this potentially pro-Soviet leader and installed a nice pro-American autocrat in his place. And so I think this only encouraged more covert action on the part of the CIA. It didn't all begin in Congo, of course, but it certainly didn't end there. And it was seen as a success. Devlin won awards for his actions in Congo. He was promoted. So that tells you sort of all you need to know about how it was viewed internally.
I'll turn this over to the audience in just a couple minutes. Given what you've written, given all the talks you've given, it has undoubtedly got you thinking about just the broader question of intervention and the interfering with country sovereignty, shaping who gets to rule, coups at the extreme, assassinations at the extreme. How broad a lesson do you draw from this case about the various interventions in the Cold War and to this day? What are your thoughts?
I think what was evident in the case of Congo, and you can just see this in all the cables and documents, is the plight of the Congolese people was nowhere on the agenda. They were not in the room symbolically even. And so to me, it's a real testament to America was playing these Cold War games, and the idea that there were literally millions of people who would be affected by these decisions was just not in the picture. And so I think it's a dire case of the consequences of it. When you're all wrapped up in your geopolitical rivalry and thinking about dominoes falling and influence spreading, it can be really easy to forget that there are actual human lives at stake. Not only the individual life of Lumumba, but the broader Congolese population. And I think it really gets me thinking about the power of paranoia, and that you look back at these cables and there's America's seeing Soviet ghosts behind every piece of furniture, and there was just not clear thinking going on. And one of the reasons you know that it was possible to have clear thinking is occasionally you see glimpses of it. You see a State Department memo on Lumumba's political orientation. You think, that totally nails him, that's exactly what's going on. And then that memo's completely ignored and policy has nothing to do with it. Or you see a proposal from a Kennedy foreign policy hand that you think that's actually a really good idea of how to get Congo out of its morass in late 1960, and then that's totally not the policy. So there were other options, paths not taken.
I'm wondering if I were on the NSC of this administration, and imagine I was involved in not efforts to assassinate people, but I was involved in efforts to prop up unpleasant governments in certain regions because that leader was against increased Chinese influence. Or maybe I was even involved in efforts to politically weak and unfriendly governments who had been getting close to China, if they were in a maritime East Asian context. And I read your book. I'm trying to figure out what correction I would make. Like, what I learned from it, again, it's another example, a terrific example, a beautifully written example of the paranoia, of seeing the Russian ghosts where they didn't exist, of seeing Russian influence where it didn't exist. So paranoia and false positives, they're all bad. But I wonder if you have thoughts, or if you have kind of guidance that you've kind of inferred from all this about how one draws the line, or where one draws the line between interference in domestic political affairs of other countries in order to shape their willingness to allow in geopolitical rivals in a variety of different ways. That's beyond the line, and that's not beyond the line. Would you go as far as to say, I mean, if the Russians wanted to partner with Cuba, that was fine. If the Russians wanted to put atomic weapons in Cuba like we did in Turkey and across Europe, that was fine. I'm not sure you'd say that, but if we're in the game of trying to shape the politics of other countries, both then and now, for the purpose of making them less willing to accept the political ties, the military bases of US rivals, if I were on the NSC and I read your book, I wouldn't want to repeat this. What lessons should I draw?
I think there's so many things the United States can do that are overt and not anti-democratic. And so to have to reach for the covert or anti-democratic tool, that means you've given up on a number of other tools. I guess I would also interrogate there's certainly places where, you can make a really strong case of why it would be bad if China did this or that on that island. But there are probably many more cases where, why does it matter if China pays for this bridge versus us? Or if they want to fund this side of this civil war in a place we don't care about, like, let them. And so I think I would tell that fictional NSC staffer to sort of check his assumptions, and is it really the case that it matters how much influence America has in this or that place, and how much influence China has? And then I'd also say that I think the real way you win the influence game is through long-term stuff, the power of your example, your culture, your diplomacy. And so often the short-term methods to achieve quick gains can undermine that longer-term stuff.
That's a terrific place to leave this. And by leave this, I just mean this part of the conversation, and to open this up to you. Do you want to call on people, or should I?
You go for it.
My colleague and friend Dirk.
Thank you so much, Stuart, for a really great presentation. I had a couple of questions that had more to do with internal Belgian politics toward the whole Lumumba issue. But before I do that, I wanted to take slightly issue with what you said, that Belgium was completely united in favor of independence of Katanga. And Belgium was actually quite divided over the issue. And it split down a lot along ethnic lines, the Flemings speaking Dutch, and the Walloons speaking French. And the French Walloons had most of the economic interest in Katanga, of course, and were very closely allied to the royal family. As a matter of fact, the crisis became so bad that the prime minister, the first prime minister at the time that dealt with the crisis, Gaston Eyskens, almost had to resign, and that lingered on for several months before Paul-Henri Spaak, the great politician, finally came in and took control over that. But this leads me to my two questions that I wanted to ask you. And the first one is, and so if I can go back for a second, if you read the French sources on this, I think you come to the conclusion that Belgium was united. If you read the Dutch sources on this, it's a whole different picture, basically. But this leads me to two questions that I wanted to ask, and that is regarding the monarchy in Belgium and how they dealt with this. And as you know, you showed the picture of King Baudouin. He was a very, very careful monarch, never got involved, and he wasn't allowed to, according to the Constitution, in any public debate at all. And yet, he got involved in two of them. One of them was an ethical issue dealing with abortion, where he didn't want to sign a bill, resigned for a day so that he could do that. But the first one really was Katanga, And he came out very forcefully in favor of Katangan independence, supporting Moise Tshombe and so on. And particularly from a Flemish, and you can probably tell that I'm Flemish by background, from a Flemish nationalist background, that has always been interpreted that the king supported the independence of Katanga because the royal family had links to the Union Minière and all the other big conglomerates and to me, that has never really made much sense, because even if Congo would have been united, the economic interest for the monarchy would not have really changed. So that was my first question. What do you think happened here that the monarchy kept weighing in, kind of contrary to what King Baldwin had done all along in his political career? And the second one really deals indirectly with it, and that is, I just told you about Gaston Eyskens and having to deal with this crisis. And he was really torn between those who wanted Katanga independent, including the monarchy, and those, particularly the Flemish nationalists, who wanted a united Congo. And it's always been argued, and I wonder if you have any evidence of that, it's always been argued that eventually Eyskens decided against independence for Katanga because there was pressure put on him by the United States, and Eyskens was particularly worried that Congo would really become a second Suez Canal issue, basically, that Belgium would go in and the United States would put pressure for Belgium to leave. So these are my two questions. Thank you.
So on your first, I didn't mean to suggest that Belgian political opinion was united on Katanga. What I meant is that if you actually look at the official policy, there was very much one of supporting the secession. I mean, the salaries of the Belgian officers were getting paid by Belgium. As you mentioned, King Baudouin came out very publicly in favor of Katangan independence, and there were two diplomats, Belgian diplomats in Katanga, who were head of the Belgian technical mission there, who were very close with Tshombe and actively working to undermine the UN. They played a role in preventing Ralph Bunche, who was the American diplomat who worked for the UN, preventing him from landing. So Belgian fingerprints are all over the Katangan independence question, even though there were people in Belgium who were not as gung-ho for it. As for King Baudouin's role, I don't have a very sophisticated understanding of the Belgian policymaking apparatus at that time, because it was weird in that there was the Minister for African Affairs who answered to the Prime Minister Eyskens, but then also Baudouin had his own sort of operation and his own advisors, and was sending, his counselors were sending cables to Congo. So it gets pretty complicated in terms of, did the left hand know what the right hand was doing? But I mean, Baudouin also, I think there probably must be some emotional attachment to Congo that he had. It was very much tied up with King Leopold. I mean, if you read his speech that he gave at Independence Day, it's this long praising of King Leopold II's work in Congo, and that's what prompted Lumumba to write his own last-minute speech essentially denouncing that. So I think, King Baudouin had also gone on this trip to Congo in, I think, 1955, and there's a whole documentary of it. So he did have this personal attachment, and what I think he and other Belgians saw was the dissolution of their great colonial project that they had spent years building. And so they then got behind Katanga as sort of the way of salvaging that. Interestingly, though, to my own surprise, pre-independence, they were very pre-Congolese independence, they were anti-Katangan secessionism. Tshombe had been flirting with it. They swatted that down and made it clear in no uncertain terms that he was not to make any secessionist moves, because that would be besmirching this wonderful unified former colony. But everything changed when the crisis happened.
Other questions? Jonathan.
Yeah. So first, great talk. I wish I could show my undergrads this talk because it has no words in the slides, which is fantastic. So first, did you see any evidence that the U.S. interest was driven by the fact that we got a lot of our uranium for, say, the Manhattan Project and our nuclear weapons from Congo? And second, just looking up on my phone, Congo's natural resource rents are 38% of GDP. To give some idea, like Saudi Arabia is 24%. So to the best of my knowledge, I've never seen a country that's that dependent on natural resources ever successfully democratize. So I'm curious as to like, what's the story by which, if we hadn't done this, this democracy survives with a country with just a massive pool of appropriable resources that goes to whoever gets them, and you don't have to incentivize people with democratic institutions and property rights to get those resources?
Yeah, so to your first question, Congo was, under colonialism, a significant exporter of uranium. The uranium used on one of the nuclear weapons dropped over Japan was Congolese uranium in it. But by 1960, there were no exports whatsoever. I believe that mine was even shut down and shuttered. And so I sort of went into this assuming that American economic interests would explain a lot. In fact, when you look at the evidence, that's not the thinking at all. It's all Cold War, communism, Lumumba's maybe pro-Soviet, that sort of thing. And it explains, I'd say, some Belgian behavior, certainly, because there were much closer economic links. I mean, almost exclusively economic links with Belgium. But in terms of American behavior, there's not a real economic interest case to be made. Perhaps it was one item on the list of why, when you're writing a memo about why Congo is strategically important, in the State Department you could add that it was a significant source of minerals, blah blah blah, but it was not a main factor. I mean, the second thing that's dismaying to hear the bad track record of resource-rich economies democratizing. I guess one question I'd have is, that number of 38% or whatever, it would be. That's not an inherent number that Congo has to have. There are other methods of economic activity that it could turn to make that a relative share, but maybe that's unrealistic. So, I mean, today Congo has just had a presidential election a few weeks ago. The incumbent won. The election was seen as at a technical level probably fair, but in the broader context of not free and fair competition, and so. Its track record would certainly support your current thesis.
Other questions? Yes.
Yes. I have two concerns, really. One is an impression I got that may not be accurate of your book, but you had limited time to present today, which is that the problems of Congo started in the 1950s. Congo probably had the worst record of contact with Europeans for over 500 years. This was an area that welcomed the Portuguese. They wanted to modernize their state. They wanted Western schools. The Portuguese missionaries said, well, then in that case, you have to finance it with the slave trade. The second largest area of Africa that hemorrhaged people into the Atlantic slave trade was Congo. Then Leopold, Baudin's grandfather, great-grandfather, Leopold I made the Congo his personal fiefdom. The British and French almost took it away because his brutality was such that it was giving colonialism a bad name. I forget whether he's British or French, Morel visited the area and described the mountains of hands that had been cut off by people who had been punished for refusing to collect wild rubber. The Belgians were the absolute worst in Africa, and that does have to be factored in, and I know you acknowledge their lack of attention to schools. The other thing is, I think it's probably a little misleading to say that it was a place that the U.S. didn't have strategic interest. The U.S. was keenly aware of its bordering of many areas, including what was going on in East Africa, where Mau Mau had just been put down. They were very concerned about Sharpeville, which had happened a few months before the independence of Congo. And so there were many things going on. Congo was seen as linked to the anti-apartheid struggle in Southern Africa and the liberation of various secessionist movements in the beginnings of the Portuguese wars for independence, as well as things like Mau Mau. So I think it's much more important in a strategic area than you suggest.
On your first point, there's a long history of exploitation in Congo. I cover it briefly in my book because I focus on on the events of 1960, but that is very real, and I think also explains some of the sort of Belgian attitude post-independence, and that, not surprisingly, the worst colonizers also sort of held on to their colonial views after independence. To give you just one example that I think is really telling, in 1955, the Belgian academic wrote a plan called the 30-year Plan for the Independence of the Belgian Congo. The idea was that only by 1985 would the country be finally ready for independence. He almost lost his job because that was seen as a radical thing to propose. And so that just gives you a sense of what the Belgian mindset was at the time. As for your second, I mean, I think you can always spin an argument about why a particular country is strategically important. But I think, here I'll paraphrase from the Church Committee had an sort of internal memo on what went wrong in the Congo. And in this memo, they sort of say the US found itself deeply involved in a place in which it had no significant strategic interest. And I think that's accurate. If you objectively look at it in terms of geography, resources that are relevant to the United States, those are, I would say, the main two ways of determining strategic relevance. It didn't check the boxes. Yes, there are many reasons one could add to that list, but also by the period I'm talking about, 1960 through 65, or the period that memo was talking about. Independence movements are sort of a fact everywhere. The Mau Mau thing's not relevant anymore. So you have to be careful at which time you're talking.
And if I understand you correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're saying is it's not simply the Church Committee looking back. It was the contemporaneous documents you looked at where the US decision makers were focused not on the mineral wealth of Congo, or not even the national security implications of uranium deposits, but on the danger of communism. That's what they were talking about.
If those other things mattered, you'd expect to see them popping up in the documents, and they don't.
If for no other reason than just rhetorical reasons to try to make their case. And they weren't even kitchen sinking them on very much.
Correct.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, sir.
Thank you. That was a wonderful speech, talk. My first question is, do you believe this shows to some extent the anti-democratic precedents of American foreign policy, especially when we're considering how it labels China and Russia, right? Such similar actions of China and Russia as grossly undemocratic, but would not hesitate to stamp out anti-American sentiments in regimes, especially in developing countries? That's my first question. And my second question is, what salient lessons should present-day Americans and also Congolese people take from this story? Thank you.
To answer your first question, yeah, I think there's a long tradition, certainly during the Cold War, but it has continued afterwards, of America backing undemocratic leaders for the sake of strategic concerns. As we were talking about earlier, I think in Congo, you don't really have to even have made that choice, because you could have gotten, there weren't really big strategic concerns, and Lumumba wasn't going to undermine them anyways. But there are certainly other harder cases. So, if you look at US policy towards Saudi Arabia today, there are arguments on both sides about whether it's a good idea for America to back such an unsavory regime. But I think the Congo is such a pure example of that logic at its worst. And what was your second question again?
What salient lessons should present-day Americans and Congolese take from that? But also, on that question, do you think it is hypocritical of American foreign policy to do that while also labeling China and Russia, especially when it comes to like 2016 elections actually, when he was very paranoid about Russia Russia having an influence in its domestic politics, in its domestic election. So do you think it is highly hypocritical of America to doing such, and when it fights countries like China and Russia doing such, it labels them as grossly undemocratic.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no shortage of examples of hypocrisy in U.S. foreign policy throughout history. And there's a rich debate in political science about how much that matters or not. As for the lessons for Americans and for Congolese, I mean, my goal was just to tell the story and to bring the history back to life. I think for Americans, at least, the lesson that I see it is one of the big ones is to not imagine that your geopolitical rival is 10 feet tall and perfectly capable and active everywhere, because that warps your thinking and leads you to do all sorts of unsavory and unnecessary things.
How about the person in the very far back?
Hello, thank you so much for this talk. I don't have much to say except that it is rare to see people from the US interested in what happened in a lot of countries or underdeveloped countries. And I would like to thank you for that and for the book and for the talk that I find really interesting. Now, I would like to ask a question about what do you think, or like how strategic is Congo today? Because you kept saying that, okay, at that time, Congo wasn't one of the main US, like the most important point for the US, right? And I wonder, right, today, like, would you say the same? Because for a country that accounts for 70% for the world of the world cobalt production, for a country that without Congo there is no green revolution. Many people won't admit that, but without Congo there is no green revolution. So people are talking about electrical cars and batteries. We need Congo's minerals for that. So from my perspective, it's a pretty important country, but I would like to know what you think about that.
I mean, I agree with you at a sort of visceral level, and the fact that it produces 70% of the world's cobalt, which is in lithium ion batteries, and as you said, crucial for the green revolution, does make it in some sense important. Those minerals are probably going to get out of the ground one way or another. And I don't think, a lot of the companies are Chinese, but it's not as if China is, taking over large swaths of the Congo and denying any revenues to the Congolese. So when you ask the question sort of like, does Congo matter today? Part of me wants to say absolutely, of course. But the other more realist part of me says that in raw, U.S. foreign policy terms, it's a peripheral concern. It's not a significant, in my opinion, battlefront between the United States versus China and Russia. I wish the U.S. did more to promote democracy in Congo, civil society in Congo. I've made that argument in op-eds myself, in part to atone for what it did back in 1960. But I think I do have to admit it's some sort of very cold calculus of strategic importance. It doesn't rank very high, or another way of putting it is there's so many other places that really do have an easier case to make of their strategic relevance. But as my book suggests, maybe the Congolese people should be grateful for that.
So in a sense, I'll come to Ben last. So in a sense, what you're saying is Congo itself is really important. Its economy is important. The minerals it provides the global economy is important. But if I understand you correctly, you're saying who sits in the seat of the Congo's political leadership should not be so important to the United States that, for example, we're tempted to intervene. Or who exactly Congolese firms trade with should not be so important to us that we start taking a nefarious role in their politics.
Yes, that's a really good way.
Fair enough. Ben, do you want to ask the last question?
I don't know if I want to ask the last one, but
I think that's your role.
okay, I'm stuck with that. First, Stuart, thanks for coming back to Dartmouth. Thanks for this incredible book and your time with us today. The question I'm interested in is about the UN. So as you kind of alluded to, this is still early in the history of the Cold War, early in the history of the UN and the world. The United States is kind of feeling its way out in this new institution. How's it going to perform? What's its role going to be in international politics? We had, just tried using it in Korea, and then at the beginning of the decade, and then at the end of the decade in Congo, and then basically, unless I'm forgetting something, a whole generation passes. It's not until the 90s, late 80s, that we start thinking about the UN as peacekeeping missions again. I don't know whether I hadn't myself thought about whether this moment was, a moment when we or others decided that we wouldn't use the UN anymore in these ways, as maybe its founders originally thought we would. I'm interested in your perspective. How did this affect the next 30 years when the UN really receded in importance in terms of direct, on-the-ground kind of interventions?
Yeah. So this was, in 1960, it was sort of, and in the Congo crisis was the exact moment, in a way, that the UN transitioned from being a sort of superpower-dominated thing, American-dominated, as in Korea when the Soviets had not voted for that resolution or not been present for the vote. And when it sort of tilted towards a discussion club for the third world. And that's because, from just a purely practical matter, there were all these new countries becoming independent and joining the UN. In 1960, there were 17 all-African countries that were the UN's new members that year. And so power within the UN started slipping away from the Americans in particular, but also from the Soviets and toward this, what was called the Afro-Asian bloc at the time. And you can sort of watch it happen in real time in Congo, where all these members are admitted in September 1960, and then that makes things harder right after that. But the UN in Congo, it was a disaster for the organization. They lost their Secretary General Hammarskjöld in a plane crash in the crisis. They got bogged down in fighting in Katanga for years, and they only really left in 63, 64. And so there were a few lessons. The UN's own lesson was, don't try that again. And the Soviets' lesson was, never vote for something like that again. And so that's why you see over the rest of the Cold War, really until I think the late 80s, mid 80s, with maybe a few exceptions, the UN basically sits out the Cold War, does not have major peacekeeping operations anywhere. The Congo was an experiment, and it failed.
Stuart, thank you for doing this research. Thank you for shining a light on this fascinating time and this tragic set of circumstances, this tragic event. And thank you for coming and sharing this work with us here at Dartmouth. It's really great to have you back. Thank you.